11:30. I call the meeting to order and roll call, please.
Mayor Rios.
Here.
Mayor Cole.
Yeah.
Malcolm Town. And Judge Mills.
Here. We have a quorum, so we'll get going with meeting. Everybody read the minutes from the last meeting? I have a motion to accept.
Motion. So moved.
Motion made. I have a second. I'll second it. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Unanimous. Okay.
Thank
We
you.
got a presentation here. I'll let her take over.
All right, thank you very much. I am going to share a screen real quick. Today, we're going to be going over.
You want to use the speakers
We can.
if somebody talks?
Okay. Just a second.
No, I've always had it.
I just didn't know.
All right, we're going to do a little bit of setup real quick and we'll be ready to go.
Go back to yours.
Okay. Let me. All right, one moment, please. We're going to get some better volume going here.
No, not sorry. Go to your video. Hit that up there. Yeah. And then, oh, maybe the other one, the mic.
Okay. Okay, I think we've got a little bit
There we go.
better video now.
We should be able to hear.
Okay, today what we wanted to do is just go over some ideas for different incentives. Several months ago, this board talked about the fact we had a request from the county to look into the status of our tax abatement policy. Specifically, there were some concerns about making sure that there was transparency in that policy and that it was built into the tax abatement process. And specifically, the individual who was asking about that also wanted to make sure that there was a good amount of waiting period and they were looking for a full process of at least 30 days. Since that time, we looked at we took a collection of any kind of documents that existed in the community. And what we found is that anything that had existed is no longer in place. It's expired. Usually the incentive policies are in place for 2 years, then they have to be brought back up to the governmental entity to be reconsidered. And so as it stands right now, the community does not have any incentive guidelines, neither for tax abatement or any other type of incentive. So as a result of that, the local government corporation engaged our Aransas County Economic Development Corporation and asked them to come up with an incentive policy and to take any of the ideas and discussions that they had out to the public and to get some feedback on it before it's brought back to the local government corporation. So one of the things that we thought we'd do is, as kind of a kickoff for that, is to do a summary of what different communities are doing out there. Just because I list various types of incentives does not mean that that's appropriate for Aransas County. What it does mean is that's what our competition is using in order to recruit various types of businesses, both with tax abatement and other incentives. That we need to be aware of that. We need to be aware of what's out there. And then we need to decide collectively as a community what we think is best as far as incentives for our community. So today, all I'm going to be doing is going over some of the options and some of the things and baseline information about the different types of incentives. This is a long presentation, so I'm going to go through it very fast so that I don't take too much of your time. The first thing just to talk about is tax abatement. That's kind of one of the basics. It's for basic type of industry and technology, biotechnology type companies that tax abatement is typically used for. And, the question is, what's the benefit of it? These are not my benefits. This is what's found on the Comptroller's Office as listed by the Texas Comptroller's Office for how they're used and also what the benefits are. So the obvious one is to attract new industry, but also commercial type enterprises. And also, most importantly, and we heard this through a lot of our different public hearings that we had about various plans, both the economic development plan, long-term recovery plan, is that retention and expansion of our existing businesses are most important to the community. So that's one baseline that we already know. And it also syncs up very well with the statistics because 80% of all anything that happens in a community as far as capital investment, 80% is usually coming from the businesses that are already here. They're expanding. So I think that's really important. According to the law, cities, counties, and special districts can do tax abatement. I have not done a specific look into the navigation district origination, the creation statutes that are out there to see if they're eligible or not. Just the statute itself and the Comptroller's Office say that special districts are eligible to engage. One that is not is the school district. There was a act that was done in 2001, the Texas Economic Development Act, that prohibited school districts from doing tax abatement. Now, there is an exception to that. What started happening is the state lost several very, very big corporations. They were unable to be competitive since the local governments were unable to offer tax abatement, and the school district represents the most substantial portion of the tax. So they did pass a subsequent law that's kind of a carve out that does allow for tax refunds. It's very industry specific. It's for manufacturing, research and development, clean coal projects, nuclear and renewable electricity, and computer data centers. And it requires a huge investment. We're looking at $1 billion. So we're probably not going to be looking at that just based upon our base for the workforce. We're not going to have that. So it's unlikely that we're going to end up in having any kind of dialogue for that kind of business. Or that type of abatement. Some of the benefits that were listed on the Comptroller's website is that it reduces unemployment, strengthens other businesses because they're bringing in jobs, employees that then go out and put more money into the economy. It increases tax revenue, both from the business itself coming into town and or expanding, plus all the other types of investments that employees make. The tax receipts continue after the abatement expires, and they called it, flexible as an economic development tool. There is a very, very defined process for tax abatement, and I'm going to go through those pretty quickly. As again, it's for city, county, and eligible other taxing units, including special districts. And the process starts with adopting the guidelines and criteria, and that's what we're here talking about today. Again, that's typically for both new and existing facilities. It involves a public hearing, and we're talking about having not only just the public hearings for ours, but also some workshops, some public workshops to talk about these issues and talk through them to make sure that we understand them. The policies that we adopt are good for 2 years. They can be amended, but only amended by a 3/4 vote by the entity that's passing it. And once that process is done and adopted, it's required that if a entity has a website, that it be posted out on a website. As I mentioned, it's effective for 2 years, and you can specify either an all or a portion of your tax for tax abatement, and the period can exceed no longer than 10 years. And in a little bit, we're going to talk about or see what that kind of looks like. Most of the language for a tax abatement agreement is kind of canned language. There's some definitions in the statute that have to be met. And so a lot of the tax abatement agreements look alike. So there's not a lot of magic in wordsmithing a tax abatement agreement. The portion that is most important is, and as seen most, is it's a table. And basically the table says, if you have this many jobs, then you're eligible for this much abatement. If you have this much capital investment, you're eligible, or a combination of the two. And so that's really the key for the community dialogue, is that piece to talk about what goes into that table. And then also what your target industries are. What is it that you want to recruit to the community? And I'll show you a little sample list in a little bit. It can also apply to the extraterritorial jurisdiction, which is the circumference around a city based on the size of a city. So we were talking a little bit about target industries, and I've kind of given you a list. Right here is a list of different types of target industries in a community that I've worked in before that we developed. And it was a tourism type community, and did want very, very light type of manufacturing and R&D. So it really focused in on some things like research and development, or corporate offices, or maybe some biotech, marine medical related. And then I threw in a couple of things here that are definitely local for marine related. And I have plastics listed on here just as a discussion item, because we just had it's a regional study that was done by the General Land Office that told us that one of the low-hanging fruits for our in target industries, and what we can leverage and what we have really good resources for, is the plastics industry at various levels. Also wanted to note that you can also have other types of target industries. These may be included in a tax abatement agreement, or they may just be in your other guidelines that you have. That's a separate set of guidelines that have nothing to do with tax abatement. So in our case, of course, tourism is really big. So there may be some situations where a project is so impactful that we might want to consider some incentives in order to recruit them, mixed use type developments, and also retail. And then there's a third category, and it just depends on the community situation as far as how much affordable housing or different types of target housing that the community is looking for. But there's also in some communities a third category that includes various types of residential. So generally speaking, and we just talked about this earlier, but to reemphasize, in a tax abatement policy, you're going to have, what's the percent of abatement per year and for how many years for the term. You'll have the capital investment thresholds that are in that chart that talk about the different levels. And that's important, because if you look at Lubbock's, their table is probably not going to look like anywhere near the same thresholds of capital investment and full-time equivalent jobs as we might expect here. So it has to really be tailored to the community, especially the threshold levels. As I mentioned before, you can do real property tax abatement, or you can also combine that with personal property. So after your guidelines are done and adopted and you go through the whole public process and the public hearings, then you go in and designate an area as a reinvestment zone. And that's just you're designating a special area for tax abatement. It can also be for enterprise zones, which is there in the lower right-hand corner. But that itself also has its own process. You have to have a notice of a public hearing. You have to put it in the newspaper 7 days before you have the hearing. You have to give written notice to all of the other taxing entities. It's a formal notice that has to go out that you certify mail to the whether it be the judge or the mayor, to give notice to those other entities that you're considering tax abatement. That process, by the way, that we're going through is only for tax abatement. It does not apply to other types of incentives. They're under a different chapter of the local government code. Once you've held your public hearings and you've allowed interested parties to speak, then you do an adoption ordinance or a order, depending on what the entity is doing. And there's some specific things that have to be in that particular ordinance or order. And a reinvestment zone expires after 5 years, but can be renewed. And so there's some thresholds, like what kind of threshold do you have to meet in order to even designate an area that a business can have in a tax abatement in? It's focused on public health and welfare. And specifically, they've got a lot of different categories that you can select that's put into the ordinance that you're saying it meets. For instance, there's a lot about substandard infrastructure. So if there's poor water, sewer, streets, sidewalks, that would be an area that would be allowed for tax abatement. Or it could have a lot of substandard or deteriorated types of structures. But there's several others. I don't want to go through them all, but that's the kind of thing that you're looking for. Also, there's a special portion. They included signs. Some communities have sign problems, and so they've included that as part of what might make an area eligible. Next thing is the tax abatement agreement itself. You provide 30 days public notice of the meeting. So you can see we've already started. We've had several layers now where we've got a time frame where we're providing public notice. So just in and of itself, the public hearing to enter into tax abatement, that's already written into the code, the state code, that you have a 30-day notice. And then you can have an approval of the agreement at the public meeting after the 30-day notice. It is by majority vote. And then as that happens, then there's a 7-day notice that you send out to the other entities. So it's likely that if tax abatement is happening in a city, that it may be considered by the county or vice versa. There's also mandatory reports that are done on an annual basis to the comptroller's office for tax abatement. Typically, tax abatements start on January 1 of the year following the signing of the agreement, but you can also make it take effect January 1 of a following year. So that's kind of the 101 for tax abatement and what is all involved in that. And one of the things that we'll be doing is we'll be pulling a number of different tax abatement agreements. We'll be pulling, policies. We'll be pulling what the city and county passed previously to see what it looks like and then have that dialogue. The second piece to that is also in the Texas Local Government Code, and it's called it's in Chapter 380 and 381. Chapter 380 for economic development is specifically for cities, and Chapter 381 is for counties. They are written very much on purpose to be very flexible and allow for some of the decision making and options to be made at the local level. So they're written very, very broadly, but basically it's to promote economic development, both for business and other commercial activity. You have to have a program, which is the guidelines that we were talking about. It's just another piece of those guidelines. It allows for grants and loans. Typically, I will say that most cities and counties stay in the realm of grants, not loans. And there's a reason why. Some of our originating documents say that, you know, the city can't lend its credit to others. And so typically cities and counties stay away from that and stay in the realm of grants. And the Chapter 381 that is for counties reads very similarly, although they had to be more clear about who might be eligible. They added the word developers in there. That flexibility is written in the local government code for cities, but you really have to have things specified more deliberately for counties and authorizations. So one of the things that communities look at is a payback. So anytime that we're looking at any type of incentive, one of the main things that's going to be looked at is a payback. And that's part of the policy that you'll put together. It'll say, this is our targeted payback. Now, there may be a reason that you want to do less or more. And you have to specify that in the agreements why you're doing less or more than what your policy says, but typically there'll be a number of years. And then there's a whole lot other criteria. This is not written anywhere in the local government code. These examples are just ones that I'm familiar with that communities have used. So one of the things that you might be looking for into whether you want to give alternative types of investments is it in a special area for the community? Have you designated target areas that you want it? Are there redevelopment zones, or is it a downtown? Or is there a area that specifically really needs redevelopment? Then you put that in there and you allow that to be part of the criteria that allows for other types of incentives. Then there's some of the basics. There's, square footage. You might have a minimum for that, a minimum for jobs. If it involves local sales tax in looking at the value of a company coming in for sales tax, you might have a threshold for sales tax. As I mentioned, sometimes if it's a strong need and there's a deficit in the community of a specific kind of housing, there might be some criteria in there. One of the things that I've seen often is a community will go in and get a study, or they already know what they want, and they'll have a specific recruitment list of certain types of companies that are going to fill a gap that's missing in the community. And so that may be one of the triggers and that allows for these kinds of different incentives is a targeted list that the communities come up with. And then you might have another layer. You may say, okay, here's what we're going to do. Here's what we'll entertain based on those criteria. Or you might say, okay, that's what we're going to do for if you consider doing for if they meet those criteria, but here's some more important criteria that may add to what we're willing to do. For instance, it could be a historic building that needs rehabilitation and it's in a strategic location that our tourists see. It might be because, again, it's in a specific area like the Rockport Cultural Arts District. So you kind of layer it. So you have your baseline, and then you may have additional that you're willing to give a little bit more or consider a little bit more incentives if they're meeting that criteria. I'm going to really quickly go over some examples of what kind of incentives do people use out there other than tax abatement. And there's a wide variety, and this is not an all-inclusive list, but just to kind of give you a flavor for some of the things that are considered. Many of y'all will have heard of the one-stop shop and expedited building plan review and permitting. That's one kind of basic example that's not an out-of-pocket, but in some cases might be something that a particular business might look for. A lot of times you'll make arrangements. We're putting together our workforce development center. You can offer to do tailor some training to that company and what they're looking for. And in addition to that, when you do a workforce development center, you usually try to make arrangements for the small business development center to come in. I believe ours is housed out of Victoria. And so one of the conversations that we'll be having through our Workforce Development Center is the possibility of bringing in the SBDC maybe once a week or once every few weeks in order to be available to meet for various types of businesses. There's the hotel motel tax. We have already have some arrangements that are already set for that. I'll just give you an example. When I was in Salado, the historic Stagecoach Hotel had been fallow and not operable for several years. We found someone that was interested in rehabbing it. But it was hard for them to do that because of how long it had been closed and some of the ambiance was no longer there. So we worked with them and set up a tourism marketing agreement where they could leverage some of the sales, the hotel motel tax that they were generating, and they could reinvest it back into marketing of that property. Some other things, development fees. There are also after the storm, we did a survey of all the city and county owned land that was just kind of sitting out there that didn't have any specific identified purpose. Sometimes you can abandon right-of-ways and that type of thing to help make a development happen. Often there's also facade improvement grants. Usually those are focused on your downtown area or other historic area in the community where it's more expensive to redevelop those and get them because of asbestos issues and various types of for flooding, other types of unique investments that need to be made in order to renovate those buildings and get them operable again. So that's kind of how those are used. Oftentimes there's a lack of landscaping in the community, or they're buying an existing site that doesn't have considerable enough landscaping. And so one of the ways that you can do that to improve corridors, special corridors, is to allow for landscaping and irrigation grants. And the same thing for sales tax incentive. This is not an example that would apply here, but just an example. When I was in Temple, Buc-ee's wanted to come to town, and the location that they wanted didn't have infrastructure. So one of the things that we did was we did an agreement with them, and we extended public infrastructure to that, and that's a grant. And that allowed them to come into town. Buc-ee's puts out considerable sales tax. I can't remember what it was. It's over $500,000 a year. I do remember that. So, there may be some reasons why there may be a sales tax refund or investment in public infrastructure in order to make something happen. Just some other ones that are less notable, but that are out there are the historic preservation grants. So some of the things that staff can do is work with a company to get basically other people's money, other types of incentives for instance, opportunity zones that we have 3 in town. That's not something that's out of pocket by the city or the county, but we can help facilitate for tax credits through those zones. And that's one thing that we can offer. We mentioned the public infrastructure. That can be done through a Chapter 380 or 381 grant, but there are also other things in the local government code for cities and counties. There's public improvement districts. Oftentimes those are created by a property owner. They petition for a city or county to create a public improvement district in order to put in some basic things like water, wastewater, maybe, for instance, there may be some undersized lines that are going into the downtown area, and you have someone who's a large property owner that might need service. One of the ways to do this is for a petition asking to create this, and then the city or county issues bonds, and then it's repaid with special assessments that are paid by the owner who requested it. And tax increment financing is even a more well-known type of incentive, but it's still infrastructure based, where it qualifies for a little bit more different types of infrastructure. But in this particular case, it's not a special levy that's paid. It's where those taxes, the new taxes that are captured from the new development, are put in a separate fund and are used to repay for the public improvements that are done. Typically especially for a tax increment financing, it's going to involve multiple taxing entities, or it just doesn't generate enough money to be able to pay for the public infrastructure. Again, there's a lot of different kinds of criteria that you can set up for the Chapter 380 and 381 grants. Some of the basics that we talked about before, like your jobs and capital investment, but also, again, is it in a targeted area? Is it a special type of architecture that's going to help the corridor and enhance the community image? Is it a quality of life or quality of place investment too? It not only contributes to the economy, but also is a strong benefit directly for citizens. So there's a lot of different type of evaluation criteria that can be used. Here's some more, environmentally compatible. Are they going to be using, and will they commit to, local contractors and suppliers? Does it meet some of the plans? The city has a comprehensive plan. They have a downtown master plan. There's strategic plans. We have identified many different ways what we want in the community. And if someone is bringing something to the table that helps fulfill a goal in those plans, we can use these incentives in order to try to get that particular investment in the community. Typically, the process is there's a formal application. There may or may not be a fee associated with it. Some communities have chosen to implement a fee so that they know that they're not spinning their wheels, or that no one's tire kicking. They're serious about bringing their investment or jobs to the community. There's an application procedure that we go through, and it's very important to have all of this criteria and everything laid out before the developer, business, whatever it may be, whoever's making that investment. We want all of this in writing before they come into town. We don't want to negotiate in the public. We don't want to show a business that we don't have our act together. It's preparation. So, and that we have talked through this and we've come to an agreement on what meets our community needs in advance. So I think that's the most important thing. Takeaway today is, why are we even talking about this? Because you want to talk about it amongst ourselves. All of the community is ourselves, and not have to debate things in front of a client, because you will absolutely lose them. You will never, and people find out. I used to do economic development for 10 years for College Station, and people that are going to invest in your community, they've been watching your newspaper. They look for how much controversy there is. They want to look, do you have your act together? Do you have everything out on the website clearly outlined so they know that they're in sync with what they want to be in sync with your goals as well, but they need it all laid out very clearly in order for a investor investment to come. So I think that's, probably the most important. But what we also need that because our Economic Development Corporation needs these sets of tools. They do not need to be guessing when they're talking to a client. They have everything already. The community's already talked about it. All they have to do is go to the criteria and make sure that what they're talking about as far as possible incentives is in compliance with the ideals that have been outlined in paper. The EDC may also do a financial analysis and look at the return on investment, or it may be just as simple as a payback, how many years. But they have all those tools and need those tools in order to work with a company in coming here. So the process after that is you have that conversation and you put together a tax abatement agreement or you put together a development agreement. And then whatever respective entity it applies to, and it may be multiple, then the EDC carries that around. In this case, we have one additional layer. We have the local government corporation. So they would go to the local government corporation and say, look, we've been talking to this client. Here's how they fit into the big picture. Here's some things we can do that don't cost anything to help recruit them here. And what do you think? Is this something you still feel like this is appropriate for what's being proposed? Once it goes through that process, only then will it go up to the city or the county or the district, whatever the case may be, to consider a agreement that actually has incentives associated with it. And then there's a whole nother public process that we go through in order to do that. So nothing is for sure. What it is trying to put together your process and your guidelines so you're ready. So when the companies come and express interest, that we have our ducks in a row and that we can treat them fairly, consistently, and they know what the community is looking for and that they're both in sync. So now we're kind of at, where do we go from here now? And this is something we don't have to, debate a particular incentive or anything that I just threw out as an example. But what I would like to hear from is what do we want our process to be? And just kind of want to open it up from there as far as, and what I say what our process would be, it's how do we want to get to the end goal, which is the first step. We're trying to get to the first step, which is to put together the guidelines, both for a Chapter 380 and 381 agreement, and then also for tax abatement. And any thoughts that y'all might have about that?
Well, thanks, Kim. This is Pat. In the time that I've been here, we've only had 2 380 agreements that we've entered, both relatively small in size, didn't cost anything, going into it, and it worked out very well, we feel, from a financial return. But we'd certainly be willing to look at everything on an individual basis, at least the city would. And from a 380, I don't know about everything's very interesting. We designated an area for a zone to set up an investment zone. I'm certainly willing to talk, but I think that's something we should all work on together with the county and town of Fulton and the city.
So Mayor, are you talking about, excuse me, I've been talking a lot. I need to get a drink real quick. Having maybe a multi-jurisdictional type of workshop to talk about specifics or?
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea because we don't this is a new venture, so we'd have to take a look and see what's available, what we'd be willing to do. There's not a whole lot of money anywhere right now to go out and try to attract some companies. And it looks like the legislature might even hold us back on a lot of different things. But yeah, I think we should probably take your framework and sit down and come up with something, because the EDC needs to have a list of what's available and what fits. I don't think there's a one size fits all, but I think maybe if they know what's available to them from each entity and collectively, it would make sense for them.
And what we could do, if it's a multi-jurisdictional, then we can sit down, I can take notes. I've actually written a lot of these policies and try to memorialize what everyone says in the workshop. I think one of the things that the mayor has said is really important. Some communities have a 4A and 4B sales tax. And so they have allocated monies for very specific type purposes, because those acts control the way that those monies can be done. But it's a sales tax that is their 4B board and or their economic development corporation has as a resource for incentives. We do not have that. So what we're talking about is focusing on not pulling some kind of incentive out of our pocket to provide a company, but we're talking about prospective types of revenues that are created by a company itself. That's basically how tax abatement works. It's the new increment of funding that comes in, and that is what is part of the debate, if any portion is appropriate in order to incentivize that company to come in. The same would apply for some other things like sales tax or other types of things. It's not something that we would be talking about any of the entities coming up with specific resources or a pot of money. It would be from new income, new revenues that are generated specifically from that particular business that would be coming in. And that's probably, a clear baseline that we need to be clear that that's what we would be talking about. Some things don't cost anything. Like I said, there's permitting, there's other programs out there like our opportunity zones that are not a reimbursement type basis or any kind of upfront. They're something that's offered by the state or the federal government that we can help facilitate. Anybody else?
I like the city of the county is willing to work any way we can to help out the EDC in any future developments. Of course, because they just need anybody else to get people here for tax purposes in the future.
I'm sorry, Bob.
I can't hear you, Judge, I think.
Good go.
We do have precedent for working on things together like this. If you'll recall, when we did the long-term recovery plan and the economic development plan, we got all of the entities together and we workshopped it. And then ultimately it was an official meetings. It was on record and posted and everything, but we had that dialogue amongst each other. One of the things that would be favorable to doing it that way is you have the opportunity to hear feedback from, all the other jurisdictions and to hear what they are and are not interested in. To the extent that it's possible, it's nice to have a lot of common elements to a incentive policy across the jurisdictions, but it's not necessary either. But it does send a more united front to businesses. But they're used to seeing, their different tax abatement tables. Different tax abatement tables, different types. There are some types of incentives that the city is authorized to do that the county is not through the local government code. Yes, sir.
I'm just going to say
EDC has a committee to study all of this and come back to the LGC with recommendations. That might be the initial process. There's a committee we already have established for this, but it all has to go through the workshop process anyway at some point.
Or let the city and the county workshop it.
And then we use that.
And
Right, either way, as long as
either way,
it's public input.
But I mean, I like the idea of like having, I mean, the multiple jurisdictions kind of agree on, their, whether it's the NAP district, the county, or whoever it may be, the city, all come together on it, versus us trying to push it to each one. It creates a united front, like you said.
you were talking about opportunity zones that have been designated in Aransas County, and you said there were 3 of them. I looked at that. I need a better map. 'Cause all I see is everything's opportunity except one little pocket of Rockport.
We have, and that's basically true. There's just a pocket that didn't qualify, and we were allowed to request up to 3 through the governor's office. But we have those originating documents, so we have better maps.
Yeah, I tried to get it online. It's not legible.
And that's part of, talking about online. Back in the old days, when I was doing economic development, everybody kind of wanted to hold their, information to themselves. The old standard was, well, let's make them call us. That's not what site selectors and businesses do. They're going to want to be able to find everything out online first. They have thousands of cities and counties that they can choose from. And so they've got their checklist and they go through first and look online. And if you meet the criteria, then you're in one pile. If they can't get the information online or you don't meet that criteria, then you're put in the throwaway pile. So it's really important that we have this dialogue and get it out on the website, because that's part of just being able to come to the table.
Kim, can we get a copy of the PowerPoint?
Absolutely.
I'll have to study that one.
Very good. So from the group's point of view, would you like to have a multi-jurisdictional first, or should we have a EDC LGC conversation and then step it up to the next level to have a multi-jurisdictional workshop? Any thoughts on that?
Kim, I think the LGC EDC meeting should come first.
Okay. Judge, your thoughts on that?
I agree with Mayor. Let's sit down and think about what we really want and go directly.
Very good. Now, those will be posted meetings. We'll post those meetings, anybody that wants to attend, because we're going to go through, a public dialogue too, to get that feedback. So we'll start looking into what would be good, to have LGC EDC meeting, and start looking at that and how we might be able to frame it up so that we can kind of talk through some of the issues. So, all right.
That'd be great.
Very good.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. And anyone that's interested, my email was on the posting. So if anybody's interested in the PowerPoint, just email me and I will be happy to send that out. Judge, you want to close out the meeting for us?
Okay. I do all the important stuff. I have a motion to adjourn.
So move.
I'll second it. Mayor Cole is on the road, so we'll leave her alone for a little bit. I know she's there, but all those in favor?
Aye.
Unanimous. All right. Thank you. Talk to you later.
All right.
Yeah, there's Kelly.
Sir.